Hello, it's Sharon. I am making this recording as an invitation to figure out what might be the role of reflexivity in critical university studies in our practice together. I think this is one of the subgroups that came out of the meeting in Port Elizabeth. Partly, I think Dina didn't know what to do with me and my questions, so she gave me a group to help coordinate and invite these conversations amongst the collective for those who might be interested. And really, it's only an invitation, and I realize not everyone will take it up. One of the things that tends to happen with critical scholars in particular is that because we are spending so much of our time contesting dominant narratives and dominant practices and creating and maintaining space for alternative perspectives, is that we don't often necessarily have time to do this kind of reflexive work. We are so busy creating space for others and for our own criticality that to look at that criticality in a reflexive or critical way seems like a luxury. But I do want to encourage us to nonetheless take that work very seriously so that we can remain accountable to each other, to the communities to which we're accountable, and to the work. One of the ways that I've thought through this is through the help of Nick Mitchell, who is a scholar in the US, a Black Studies scholar, who is sort of at the edges of critical university studies there. So one thing that became evident to me when we met in Port Elizabeth was a question that I'm not sure we had the time or the space to answer because we had so many things to talk about. But it comes from David Scott, who's a Caribbeanist scholar, and he has this concept of problem spaces. And he notes that often we frame academic work as a kind of question-answer exercise. And one thing that tends to happen is that we don't historicize our questions. And so often we have these outdated questions, and all we do is provide new answers. But what we don't sometimes realize is that the context has shifted so much that we actually need not just new answers, but actually entirely different questions. So what is the problem space that we're responding to with our academic research? And I think I would encourage us to consider, depending on our contexts, of course, what is the problem space we're responding to? Because the university that we have now and the context that we're facing is not the same as in 1994 in the case of South Africa. It's not the same as in the post-war golden age as in the US. It is a different place that requires potentially different questions. And if we sustain the same old questions, then we might be missing some really important conversations and considerations. And I think this can potentially help aid in the sort of translations and conversations across generations in particular, because we might realize that especially if we were trained in a particular era that had a particular problem space or set of problem spaces, our whole intellectual trajectory and orientation might be shaped by that era and its problem spaces. And then when young people come along and have different questions because they're working in a different problem space, we might need to see that, oh, okay, this is a different problem space. And so, of course, they're asking different questions, which doesn't mean that the questions that we had asked previously are not important or were not important. No, they were responding to a particular time and place, and perhaps things have shifted, but we need to understand the historical and social context of these different problem spaces so that we can respond appropriately, and that we don't necessarily need to have a contest over which question is better or worse, but we can say which question is more or less responsive to the context we have. Now, that being said, there's also different responses to the same problem space. And this is a lot of my work, which has to do with social cartographies, and in particular, social cartographies of different theories of change. And I consider a theory of change to be made up of two basic elements. The first is the diagnosis of the problem. And the second is a proposed response to the problem. And we might think that often the proposed response will follow logically from the analysis or the diagnosis, but it's not always the case. But how we define the problem that we're facing will then shape the response that we have. And that's another way where we can understand, well, why is it that even though we all seem to be concerned about the university as such, we have such different ways of approaching it? So I would encourage us, as this sort of network proceeds, to think about, of course, a cartography of critical university studies as a field and its different approaches and theories of change, which Luan already started in a beautiful way as he presented at the conference. But then even more specifically, a cartography of approaches to critical university studies within this collective. So what are the different assumptions that underlie our approaches and theories of change? What are the horizons of hope that we're working with? And sometimes we have made these things clear and explicit, but sometimes not. Sometimes they're implied, and sometimes we assume that everyone is sharing the same assumptions and horizons of hope. And generally, I find in my experience that it can work for a while to people be organized around a particular issue like critical university studies and come to it with different approaches. But if we don't take the time to kind of distinguish the different positions we're coming from, then it can lead to issues further down the road because we are projecting onto others the assumption that they have the same orientation as we do. And I would say that it is certainly not the case that we can't work together just because we have different theories of change. On the contrary, I worked on several projects where people come to a shared problem of concern, but from different perspectives. And it has greatly reduced conflict and anxiety for us to be able to reference this kind of cartography and say, here's my approach coming from this perspective. I now understand why your approach is different. And it's not a competition for hegemony, right? Because each approach offers something. And in particular contexts, it might be more useful than others, but there's no need to discern one particular answer or one particular theory of change. So again, as I noted at the beginning, I think there's a lot of bracketing we do in our critical work in order to get things done. There's a lot of nuance that we aren't always able to bring if we want to be effective. There's a lot of time spent asserting the kind of righteousness of our approach to get things done. And this can be very important and very effective for making transformative change. At the same time, I think it's really important that we do have spaces to unpack and to unbracket the things that we had to bracket to do our critical work. And that's where, again, the work of reflexivity might be useful because we can't always do it with our colleagues. We can't always do it in our institutions. But if we have a network like this, then why not have it be a space where we can unbracket together and talk about our uncertainties, our potential failures, and how we might feel like we're running in circles. So one thing that might be useful for us to distinguish is between reflection and reflexivity. So for me, anyway, reflection is more like observing my response or my thought and simply kind of describing what it was. Whereas reflexivity goes deeper and really tries to get at where that response, where that affective or intellectual response is coming from. And I kind of describe this as watching yourself watching. So you're observing yourself and your responses to kind of get at a meta level about what your investments are and what your desires really are, and things that you might not want to see but you know are important for us to look at. So another way of thinking about this is mapping ditches so that we can learn from old mistakes and create radars for those mistakes so that we don't keep going in circles and that we have the opportunity not to be perfect, but rather to make new mistakes, because there's no point in making the same old mistake again and again. So one thing that we might do as part of this reflexive work is to find out where we often get stuck or where the traps are in this work of critical university studies, so that the people that come after us and even ourselves can know and benefit from that knowledge of here's a trap, and be cautious and be careful and be reflexive, and Elon Kapoor even says hyper self-reflexive, to be accountable, and at the same time recognizing that we're not transparent to ourselves, that's why we need each other to bounce ideas off of and to ask someone else, well, what is it that I'm missing, or what is it that I'm glossing over because I don't actually want to see perhaps the full extent of the problem, or the full depth of complexity, or the full extent of my own complicity in the problem. So with my research group, a different research group called Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, we've actually created a cartography of these ditches. And we say, again, creating radars for these different patterns of response. And we, of course, learned this and made this list for ourselves before anyone else, because it's patterns we saw in ourselves, and then, of course, in the groups that we're working with. So this might be useful for us, and it might be that we need a different cartography, but I'll just briefly go through them. Again, potentially for the content, but also as an illustration of what a mapping of ditches might look like. So we say lapsed because in our context anyway, these ways of enacting social justice have become under critique, and rightfully so. So one of them is heroic leadership, and that is basically looking for a hero to project all of our hopes and dreams on, and often we generally put that hero beyond critique, and we assume they can do no wrong, and that's of course a lot of pressure for them or for ourselves, and it becomes a celebratory approach to change, and becomes about the individual instead of about the work itself. Then there's canonical authority, which is the search for the idea that some intellectual or some knowledge tradition will have all the answers. So whether it's Marx, whether it's Gloria Anzaldúa, whether it's Mbembe or whomever, the idea that someone has the answers and they can just tell us what to do, and this, of course, forgets about the partiality of all knowledges, of all responses, and forgets that all knowledges are in ignorance, and at the same time that all knowledges have something contextual to offer. But it's a search for certainty in finding that canonical hero. Then there's virtue posturing, so positioning oneself as innocent or virtuous, and in particular the idea that if I say the right thing and if people see me as doing good, then that means I'm good, that I'm not part of the problem because I have a great critique of imperialism or a great critique of racial capitalism, instead of seeing ourselves as potentially both critical but also complicit at the same time. Then there's formulaic solutions, so looking for easy answers or answers that can be applied anywhere and everywhere, and I think that might not be such an issue with this group in particular because we come from such different places that it's so clear that no one answer for critical university studies could be possible. So maybe that's a real strength of this group, actually. Projective empathy, so that's the idea that we think that if we feel empathy for another group, a particular marginalized group, that somehow means that we understand their experience, and that somehow we are less complicit again because we feel something, we feel bad, or we think we feel their pain, which really becomes more about us than them. And then finally, redemptive desire, so the idea that we do things in order to feel good or absolve ourselves of complicity. So again, I'm not saying that this cartography will work for this group, probably not, but it's just an example of the kind of thing that we might create collectively to see what, depending on what the patterns are in this group. And of course, what we observe in each other, ourselves, in our own contexts. So my last slide is just some orienting questions and then one possible proposed approach. And I'm very happy to throw that out if there's a better one, or rethink this. So one question that we might consider is, how can we avoid institutionalizing critical university studies for its own sake? How can we make sure that this is a living, breathing field of study, and if it becomes clear that it's no longer serving the purpose that it meant to and that it can, then we don't hold on to it just because we've invested a lot of time into it. And how can we also be wary of the traps of institutionalization, of what we might end up compromising in order to get a foothold or get the funding that we need? There's always things to be cautious of there. How do we develop, or in some cases, for many of us, sustain what we've been already working on, the stamina for the long haul of this work? And I think, and again, this might be me speaking very much in my context, but for people in particular in the global north, I think there's a long way to fall in the crash of potentially economic stability, but also ecological stability. And for much of the rest of the world, they've already been experiencing this for a long time. But for us here, I think there's going to be a rude awakening at some point, and I'm wondering how we can develop the stamina to help people fall apart in those moments in generative ways, and how can our work support that, and how can we support it for each other? How can we keep sight of differences between strategic moves and then conversely moments that are appropriate for reflexivity? So by what I mean by that is that sometimes in our context we have to make statements that cannot allow for complexity, cannot attend to complicity, cannot address many different possibilities, but has to put forward one approach because it's the most effective way to make a point, or it's the only way that can be legible. And how can we both do that and at the same time remember that that's not the only way, that is a strategic move that's not everything? And how can we save these spaces for questioning maybe what we did the day before and asking, well, was that the right thing? And what did we compromise in doing it? And how can we in the future make space for some of those complexities, etc.? And then relatedly, I think it might be worthwhile for us to think about what's the difference between the job and the work. And this is, again, coming from discussions I have with my research collective, which is the job is the thing that pays the bills. So if that's us as professors, then that's the teaching, the research, the service. And we might actually really enjoy that and find it important. But it's not necessarily the same thing as the work, the wider thing that we are working towards, which is potentially something that is not welcome in our jobs, and that we need to figure out which activities go where, and to make sure that we're not trying to collapse the two, because a lot of the work might not be something that we can do as part of the job. Sometimes it can, and that's great, but it's potentially useful to keep the distinction between the job and the work. The other question we might ask is, how can we have difficult conversations without relationships falling apart? So in my experience, I often see two kinds of contexts. One is where people are so concerned with maintaining the strength of a relationship that they go along to get along. They don't address tensions or differences or difficulties because they're too afraid that the relationship is fragile and won't be able to sustain a conflict or even a disagreement. Conversely, I find there are spaces when it becomes a competition for criticality and who can be the most critical, who can be the most righteous, and that is not a great setup for good relationships either. So how can we find something in between where we have these difficult conversations, but we're able to sustain our respect for each other and our commitment to doing the work? Relatedly to this issue of strategic moves, I think we can try to ask, how do we know what's good enough for now and safe enough to try as we're trying out different approaches to critical university studies, knowing that it's not the end-all be-all, and knowing that we also need to create space for learning from mistakes and failures so that we don't repeat the same ones over and over again, but rather make space for new mistakes. So my conclusion of all of this and my proposal and invitation is that for those who are interested in this work, we could have periodic virtual meetings to kind of unpack and unbracket and raise the questions and problems and paradoxes that we aren't able to raise in the job potentially because we are just exhausted and from trying to make space for these critical conversations, but that amongst ourselves we could do this for each other. We could be sounding boards. We could, as we say in my group, hold the bucket if we need to vomit, and potentially help each other work through really difficult conundrums, and or we could do this on an ad hoc basis where if someone has an issue like this, they write an email to the group and say, this is what I'm dealing with, or this is the summary of it. I'm wondering if there's someone who can support me as I think through it, and whoever's ever willing and able to respond can. So that's just one possibility. I'm super open to others' ideas, and if you've made it to the end of this slideshow, thank you, and wow. Hopefully it was useful in illustrating the kind of thing that I was thinking about when I mentioned that it might be worthwhile for us to spend some time engaged in this reflexive work. So thanks.